Today I intend to demonstrate how working on a non-keyboard repertoire from the classical and early romantic periods can serve the modern performer and student to deepen his or her understanding of the stylistic conventions and musical language of the era. So of course when we speak of the classical period, we have Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven as the great musical sons of the time. Important seminal studies on the keyboard literature of the period seem to emphasize this strict categorization. One only has to think of Rosen's The Classical Style or Sandra Rosenblum performance practices in classical piano music, where the bulk of the discussion centers on musical extracts from Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. Statements that justify the omission of other composers are often blatant. While there were other composers active at the time, we are told by Rosen, their music was not significant or original enough to be worth our consideration. Am I speaking clear enough? We might choose to believe this statement, yet at some level we are perfectly aware that neither Mozart nor Haydn invented all the expressive traits and musical syntax of the time. We also know that both composers, together with young Beethoven, had to compete often for commissions, performances, posts, and wealthy students, and that many times they had difficulties making ends meet. So who were Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven's competitors? Who were their immediate artistic predecessors and contemporaries? What did these composers contribute to the musical language of the era? And are their works interesting enough to be resurrected? You can see in this illustration from 1799, from the most important German musical journal of the day, the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung. Here we quickly grasp how most Germans at the turn of the 19th century understood their own musical tradition. Johann Sebastian Bach occupies the center of a musical sound, and is surrounded by Handel, Haydn, and Karl Heinrich Brahms, who was a composer of Italian serious opera and Kapellmeister to Friedrich the Great. Two levels of praise surround these names. The first level includes familiar names such as Mozart, Gluck, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, and Telemann, but also names of contemporaries of Mozart and Haydn, which we have all but forgotten today. Among them, Van Hal, Leopold Kozeluch, and Pleyel. These three last composers contributed many works to the keyboard repertoire and also aided in the development of the fortepiano. The second level of praise also has names of significant keyboard composers and theorists of the second half of the 18th century. Among them, Daniel Gottlob Tuck, Wolf, Hessler, and Johann Georg Albrechtsberger. In the past 15 years, through the systematic creation of online music databases, such as IMSLT, we have begun to gain access to the music scores of many of these composers. Throughout the 20th century, the majority of their works were not republished or recorded, and therefore remained inaccessible to a vast majority of performers and scholars. Our direct access to at least part of their keyboard publications and manuscripts is quickly transforming our understanding of keyboard music in the classical and early romantic eras. I will focus today on compositions by Stefan, Johann Baptist Van Hal, Daniel Gottlob Tuck, and Ferdinand Ries. As we shall see, these four figures were much admired and respected during their lifetimes, and had their own particular voice to contribute to the development and proliferation of keyboard music during that period. The first two composers, Stefan and Van Hal, were active in the Viennese court during the 1750s and 1760s. They illustrate the important influence of Bohemian composers in the formation of the early classical style. They also illustrate how the innovations of the galant style began to gain prevalence in keyboard compositions of the time. In the past decade, I have studied, taught, and re-edited for Altaria publications in New Zealand several compositions of these four composers. I have also recorded them for Naxos and grand piano labels, in a variety of historical keyboard instruments in museums and collections in Europe and the United States. Here you see three characteristic historical keyboard instruments of the era. A Silverman spinet, now housed at the National Music Museum in Vermilion, where they incidentally have the best drum I've ever played in my life, in South Dakota of all places. A beautiful Kinsey clavichord housed at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and the Bern fortepiano in Amsterdam, which is restored by France.
It's the Tsalka.
And the Bern, which is still in Amsterdam. Born in a small town in Bohemia, Stefan was trained in music from an early age by his father, the church organist and schoolmaster of the village. At age 15, he was forced to relocate to Vienna after the Prussian army invaded his hometown. There he continued his musical studies under the tutelage of the renowned Viennese theorist and keyboardist, George Christoph Wagenseil, who had recently been appointed by Maria Theresa as imperial court composer. As a result of this association, during the 1750s, Stefan's reputation as keyboard virtuoso grew. He would often release Wagenseil from his teaching obligations. His first surviving keyboard compositions, brief minuets and contradances, seem composed especially for pedagogical purposes. Stefan eventually became a reputed keyboard teacher on his own terms. In 1766, he was appointed as Klaviermeister to the court, where he taught some of the imperial children, among them young Marie Antoinette. Stefan, together with more recognized figures of the period, such as Haydn and Van Halen, had a significant role in developing, through his keyboard sonatas, keyboard concerti, and lieder, the Viennese classical style. Musicologist Howard G. Picton, a specialist in Stefan and Czech music archives, believes that one of the reasons that today the composer's keyboard compositions receive limited attention and recognition is because Stefan published during his lifetime only a small quantity of them. In addition, after his death, most of his manuscripts were taken back to his native homeland, where they remained in almost complete obscurity until the mid-1960s, when the first dissertation on the composer was published by Czech musicologist Dana Sektová. Picton's monograph in English on the composer's life and keyboard works appeared only in 1989. In the slide, you can see a list of Stefan's extant keyboard compositions. I have compiled it from Picton's 1989 thematic catalog. It is important to note that most of the concerti and incidental works remain in manuscript form. It was in his early published collections of sonatas and divertimenti that Stefan first manifested his maturity and originality as a composer. He presented his opus 1, 2, and 3, each containing 6 divertimenti or sonatas in quick succession. It is easy to surmise from the context of opus 2 that Stefan was familiar with the formal organization of the divertimenti of his teacher Wagenseil. Similar to these works, Stefan tends to include 3 or 4 movements in his sonatas. The minuet also has a privileged spot within the composition, linking the origins of the Viennese keyboard sonata to the Baroque suite. Stylistically, there is also a connection between master and pupil. There is an elegant vocal facility in the melodic line of both Stefan and Wagenseil, and a certain transparency in their musical textures. Both are, of course, characteristic of the Galant style, which was heavily influenced by Italian opera. So enough chatting, I'll start playing for you now. I will play for you a slow movement from the second sonata by Stefan. And I will use 4 instruments today. This is, of course, one of the earliest instruments we have in the collection, a square piano from 1760. The first movement of the sonata in G major, also from Opus 2, is longer and more virtuosic. So I've spent some hours practicing the instruments, and I found out that this slightly later instrument actually works best because it has this biting quality, as you'll hear. And I hope the early music police will not come and kill me at the end of the... By the way, everything I'm playing is, of course, without repeats to fit in within the format. So everything is at least twice as long. So if the movements seem very short, yes, I can. Perfect, perfect, great, great. This movement also holds evidence that Stefan's sonatas were not meant only for the harpsichord. In the first page of the score, he asks for no less than 9 fortes, sometimes in successive measures. This indication, which would be very hard to realize, even on the double manual harpsichord, is perfectly idiomatic on the clavichord. One should remember that even though the harpsichord was the favorite instrument in Vienna during the 1750s and 1760s, the clavichord was also present in many Austrian homes. It would not be until the 1770s that the first fortepianos arrived in the city. We now move to our second composer, Johann Baptist van Hal. He was born in Bohemia and trained to become Kapellmeister by local musicians such as Anton Erban and Matthias Nowak. He moved to Vienna in 1761. There he quickly developed a reputation as virtuoso violinist, keyboard pedagogue, and prolific composer. In the 1760s, he came in contact with the child Mozart, Gluck, Dittersdorf, and Haydn. Like Haydn, he played a central role in the development of the Viennese instrumental music during the 1770s. Between 1760 and 1780, he composed circa 100 symphonies and 70 string quartets. These range from experimental works which mix features of the composer's Baroque heritage with the fashionable Sturm und Drang, to more regular and stable works in 4 movements, where we see the initial sonata form use. These works were admired not only in Vienna, but also in Paris, London, and in Italy. During the late 1770s, Vanal reacted to the depressed financial capabilities of the Viennese nobility, who could no longer afford to keep their own private musical establishments, by composing fugue symphonies and string quartets. In the 1780s, he began to publish for companies such as Artaria, Hummel, Eder, and Sauer, and he writes numerous keyboard compositions, song, duos, and trios of various difficulty. These range from simple one-page lessons to intermediate-level sonatinas to brief programmatic compositions, fantasies, variations, very often dedicated to patrons and to students. He must have been a popular teacher since he had numerous students, some who became later on famous players, such as Czerny and Ignaz Pleyel. The composer was particularly original and improvisatorial in his multi-movement capriccios, which is sometimes referred to as caprice sonatas. During the 1780s, he composed in quick succession several sets. Each one presented 3 works, and in the later opuses, he indicates that they should be performed without pauses, so as one cycle. In August 2013, I recorded for the label Grand Piano 2 sets of his capriccios. This was done in Berlin. Their elegant but energetic, at times even symphonic compositional style seem an ideal medium to introduce modern audience to the beautiful expressive diversity of Vanal's keyboard works. I will play for you the first movement of his Capriccio, Opus 15, number 2. My exploration into the impressive variety of composers during the classical period really began with the renowned North-German theorist Daniel Gottlob Turk, author of the most important and extensive pedagogical treatise, Klavierschule, or the School of Clavier Playing, from 1789. From 2010 to 2014, I recorded 30 sonatas by Naxos and edited the same number for Artaria publications. It is important to note that during the past century, only 4 of his sonatas were published. Piano teachers still know Turk mainly as the composer of 120 short pedagogical pieces called the Klavierstücke. These are given to young children because of their colorful titles and progressive introduction to a diversity of technical and expressive musical resources. Turk's musical training, which he received as a teenager in Dresden from Gottfried August Homilius, who was a former student of Johann Sebastian Bach, prepared him for the varied musical roles which he had to adopt throughout his professional life. When he became a student at the University of Leipzig in the early 1770s, the keyboard virtuoso Johann Wilhelm Hessler introduced him to Immanuel Bach's important musical treatise, Versuch über die wahre Art, das Klavier zu spielen, as well as to his keyboard sonatas. On the screen you can see the sequence of publications of his different collections. Turk, under the supervision of his mentor and friend Johann Adam Hiller, composed his first 2 collections of sonatas. These 12 works were initially published by Breitkopf in Leipzig and Halle in 1776 and 1777. Because of their popularity, the 2 collections quickly went out of print. After he began a long and fruitful career as director of music at the University of Halle, 6 more volumes of his sonatas, mostly intended for students and amateurs, were released by Breitkopf from 1783 to 1793. The Klaviersonaten Grosten Teils für Kenner was the only collection which Turk specifically dedicated to professional players. His keyboard collections grew directly from his understanding of the contrasting expressive potential of the sonata genre as developed by North German composers during the 1750s and 1760s. For Turk, the keyboard sonata was the perfect aesthetic medium to express the boldest and most experimental of ideas. The close identification between keyboardist and orator was clearly established by Immanuel Bach in his Versuch, decades before Turk began composing his sonatas. Turk consciously cultivated the declamatory style in his keyboard works. As he himself stated in Klavierschule, every emotion and passion can be expressed in this genre. For the more expressive a sonata is, the more the composer can be heard. The more the composer avoids the commonplace, the more excellent is the sonata. End of quote. Taking his comments into account, it becomes clear that one should avoid the erroneous perception that Turk and other German and Austrian composers of his generation could only express over-refined, elegant emotions in their work. It is true that when compared to grand sonatas conceived for the fortepiano and concert hall by slightly later composers such as Beethoven and Clementi, Turk's affective musical gestures appear limited to modern listeners. But within the aesthetic context of the 1770s and 1780s, his musical vocabulary is both varied and eloquent. The second movement contains some of Turk's most moving and touching elements of his compositional style. And you can see here the beginning of a second movement and the close relationship of musical affect and phrasing. I will play the example for you. etc., etc. Too declamatory for my own senses. From a pedagogical perspective, Turk's 48 sonatas are excellent vehicles for young pianists preparing to play the more complex repertoire of Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven. By their careful markings and well-thought structure, these works introduce the harmonic, rhetorical, formal, and expressive laws governing the musical style of the era. Lessons learned from these sonatas can later assist the student and performer to identify technical and expressive divergences from these parameters in more advanced repertoire, and to interpret their significance. I will play for you the sonata in A minor, and you can see this on the screen together with the formal organization of the work. In Klavierschule, Turk outlined the sequence for studying keyboard repertoire. During the first year of training, the beginner learned only short and uncomplicated Handstücke and Singstücke. Then he proceeded to study simple partitas and the very short movements of sonatinas. And then he moved forward towards the sonata style. This is what Turk tells us. Now it is fitting to turn to short sonatas, which are available at present in great number. I have myself only recently published 2 sets designed for this purpose. I would not use my Leichte sonatas during the first year, for although there are no difficult passages in them, they presuppose an already somewhat refined taste and individual feeling, if they are not to become loathsome to the student. When pupils have progressed further, the sonatas of Gressler, Gruner, Blum, Haydn, Wolf, Hessler, C.P. Bach, etc. may be studied with them. End of quote. This progressive approach to the repertoire of the classical era is an art which we have lost today in many aspects. Very young students are often asked to confront the interpretative, technical, and expressive challenges of a sonata by Haydn or Mozart. It is often assumed that by sheer repetition and by listening to recordings, the student will observe the correct interpretative style. Auditive and mechanical repetition, however, cannot be equated to true stylistic understanding. This is why sonatas by unknown composers such as Turk, Vanel, and Stefan can be so useful to the young keyboardist. Since at present there are no established interpretative traditions associated to them, Turk's careful notation in his scores, in combination with the technical and aesthetic instructions in Klavierschule, become essential, forcing the young performer to avoid a standardized performance tradition, and thus to reach a more cohesive, personal, and vital interpretation of the musical score. The last composer in today's discussion, Ferdinand Ries, exemplifies this principle in his works, which stand in close relation to those of Beethoven. Beethoven taught him for several years in Vienna. For much of the 20th century, Ries was known primarily as Beethoven's friend and biographer. During his lifetime, however, he was renowned for his original composer, and it is as such that he has become increasingly esteemed by the music world in recent years. For over 30 years, he concertized with great success throughout Europe and lived for several years in England, Vienna, Paris, and Frankfurt am Main. This allowed him to come in direct contact with the most advanced instruments of the day and to fully explore the expressive and technical possibilities of the expanding fortepiano. He composed 9 piano concertos, 20 piano sonatas, and numerous chamber works. He lived in London between 1813 and 1824 and published many variation sets, rondos, and fantasies for the growing middle class of the city. In 2013, I inspected together with Dr. Angelica Minero Escobar the first edition of Ries' London works at the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin. I was surprised by the sophisticated musicality and variety of emotion found in them, and then decided to record some of them. This was done at the Schubert Club in St. Paul, Minnesota, released by Naxos, and it is called Romantic Variations, Fantasies and Rondo, based on national songs and literary themes. You can see the back cover. I will play for you the last work in the CD, an introduction in rondo in E-flat major, in other words, alla zingaresco, in other words, gypsy style.
I wanted to say as well that in the past 15 years, the compositions have caught the imaginations of both performers and musicologists, and many of the piano sonatas, concerti, and symphonies have now been recorded. There is still a lot of work ahead. There are as many as 186 compositions with opus numbers, another 100 without opus numbers. And one can say that after at least 150 years, this is the first time that these works are starting to be appreciated again. And perhaps that is the case to some extent with Vanal and Turk as well. But there is a lot of work to do, which I hope you'll all joining me in doing, because it's just too much. A prejudice against obscure or non-repertoire persists among a significant amount of piano performers and instructors. Many believe that if a composition is not performed, there must be a plethora of valid reasons for its exclusion from the standard repertoire. More often than not, it is assumed that unknown compositions are simply too mediocre or outmoded. While occasionally these assumptions turn out to be true, our duty as musicians is to investigate prior to making up our minds about unknown works. The value of a composition should be determined by its musical interest and not by its lack of inclusion within the modern textbooks of music history. But I know that I'm basically preaching to the choir here. So I thank you very much also for all the other fantastic lectures and the one we'll still hear. And let us skip the questions for a later time over coffee, because we are running slightly late. Thank you.